Hi, Dave Scotland for cgswot.com and welcome to another tutorial. Today we're going to take a look at some very basic modeling techniques in 3D Studio Max. Now, I got a few emails from people that haven't used 3D Max before and wanted to know where to start when modeling is concerned. So what I thought I'd do is do something based on primitives. We're going to build a little scene in a moment, and it's just going to be a very simple snowman scene, and we're only going to use primitive objects. Now, what are primitive objects? Well, the basic building blocks of any model, no matter how complex it may be, is it usually starts with primitive objects. Now, 3D Studio Max comes with an array of what are known as primitive objects, and it's no different to any other 3D piece of software. In 3D Max, you can locate these in the Create tab under Geometry, and it's the top of the list is Standard Primitives. And you've got all these other options, and hopefully down the track I'll probably do a tutorial to cover some of these. But today we're just looking at Standard Primitives. And you can create an incredible amount of real world or everyday objects just based on these primitives. So let's take a quick look at the primitives that are available, and you can see the list here. We have a box, a sphere, cylinder, torus, teapot, cone, geosphere, tube, pyramid, and plane. So let's have a look at those. I'm just going to maximize my screen here. We'll start with the first one. And it's a box. Now, if we go into the Modify panel, you'll see that it has a length, width, and height setting. And if you change these, then obviously the size in that dimension will change. And it also allows for different segments. Now, I'm just going to go into a shaded wireframe mode so that you can see what that does. Now, if I can increase the length, width, and height segments just to bring more detail to the box. And you know, if I was to model this into, say, a letterbox or an engine, like a jet engine or something like that, I would have to include enough segments to start editing those surfaces or editing those faces. And it's important when you use primitive objects to start your model that you give enough segments to then go ahead and create the intricate detail that you need for the model. So there's the box, pretty simple one. The next one is a sphere, and it has a couple of settings that we can change. First is the radius, and the radius is literally the size of the sphere, and the segments is the amount of segments within the sphere. And the more we increase that amount, we can get a smoother sphere. Now, the default when you create a sphere is around about 32 segments. And if I go to a front view and just zoom right in here, you can see that it's actually quite squared off. It's not very smooth. But if we really increase that amount of segments, we get a much smoother curve to the sphere. But it comes at a cost, because look how many faces or polygons are now in that sphere. So, you know, you do have to be aware with ramping up these values what it actually, what impact it has on your memory. The other thing that we can do here is use the hemisphere setting. Now, the hemisphere just cuts the sphere in half, but it also provides, if we look underneath here, it also provides an underlying face. And that can be quite handy, especially for starting your modeling process for some sort of shape that you want to get that requires that face, and it actually cuts in the edge detail back to the center, to one central point in the middle. Now, you've got chop and squash, and at the moment we're chopping the sphere using the hemisphere. But if I switch that to squash, notice that the more we increase the hemisphere, we're still staying with 69 segments, and they're just getting squashed up tighter and tighter at the top. Whereas if we use chop, we're literally losing segments, so that by the time we get to the top here, there's nowhere near 69 segments in that shape. So they're the difference between those two. I'll just pop that back to 0. And the next shape is a cylinder. Now, we use this quite a lot, a cylinder. It's very handy for hoses, for even for the basis for legs and arms for a character model. So we've got radius, which is the size, the size in the circle dimension. We've got height, and then we've got height segments, cap segments, and sides. Now the sides operate the same as with the sphere to give it a smoother curve. So the more sides, the smoother it is. So I might just crank that up a little bit higher. Now the top you'll see is one complete surface, but we can put cap segments, and the more cap segments we put on there, the more detail we're cutting into that surface. Same for the bottom. And then height segments allows me to increase the amount of segments up the top. So if I wanted to put a bend modifier on this and actually have it flex, I would need a lot of segments to make sure that it doesn't square off through that process. The next one is the torus. Now it's called a torus, but ultimately you'd probably know it as a donut or a wheel. But in 3D circles, it's called a torus. Now it's got two radius, and there's an inner and outer radius. And if you increase the radius 1, it brings the center radius out. And the radius 2 is the distance between the center radius and the outside radius. So if I wanted to make it quite a skinny donut and then move it in and out, that's what I would have to do. Now we can rotate. You can see that there are, I might just bring this back to a fatter donut. Now if I rotate, you can see that I'm rotating the mesh detail, which can be handy. You can animate that and get some interesting effects. I can twist, but notice that it's got to come back and join back to its original position, and the twist can actually cause some undesirable effects there. And we can increase the segments, which makes it smoother, and then we can increase the sides, which makes it smoother in cross section. So there we have the torus. We also have the teapot. And why would we have a teapot? Well, a teapot is used basically for lighting, texture tests, things like that. You wouldn't use it really unless you actually specifically needed to model a teapot, and even then you would probably model that from scratch rather than use the teapot primitive. So realistically it's used for lighting tests, shading, a couple of testing your modifiers, things like that. And the reason for it is it has convex, which is the sort of outer curving edges, but it also has concave angles on it, like in the handle here, like inside the spout. And so that mixture of convex and concave shapes is very handy for showing, is your lighting working, how are your materials being projected onto the surfaces. And we can get rid of some parts. We can get rid of the handle, the spout, the lid, and if you hide the body, you've got no teapot. You can bring them back in any order you want. You can tick and untick smooth. With it unticked, you've got fairly squared off faces. If you tick it, it's nice. It's a nice and smooth sort of surface, and you can increase the segments to make it even smoother still. And the radius is literally just the size, again similar to a sphere. Next one is a cone. Now, unlike the cone that you're probably used to, it doesn't have a point unless we go to this radius 2 and put in 0, and then it'll have a point and it'll be similar to the cone that you're used to seeing. But it's very handy the fact that we have two radius. Radius 2 is the top radius. Radius 1 is the bottom radius, or literally opposing ends, because I could literally wind this one in and wind that one out, and you would assume that this is maybe the top. So basically it's a radius at either end. So I might just put that back to where it was before, something like that. And then we have our height to give us the height of the cone. And then we can increase the detail similar to the other one. The cap segments, you'll see there at the moment, it's just one polygon on top. Then I can increase the cap segments to give more detail on the top, and then sides to make it smoother around the edge. Just pull that back a little bit. Next one is the tube. Now this is very handy as well for using. There's many instances where you would need to use a tube. Actually, it looks like I've got 2 tubes in my collection here. So I might just get rid of this one and we'll stay with this one. So the tube has 2 radius. It's got an outer radius and it's got an inner radius. Or radius 2 is on the outside, radius 1 is on the inside, and that will allow me to make the tube as thick or as thin as I need it. And then I've got my height setting, and then of course I can increase the amount of detail. Now in the cap segments, you'll see that by default on 1, it just literally has 1 face on the edges here, and I can increase that detail there. I can also increase the sides to make the tube smoother. So the last primitive is, second last primitive, sorry, is the pyramid. Now it's a true pyramid, it has 4 sides. A lot of people believe a pyramid has 3 sides. It doesn't. Well, it's actually got 5 sides if you include the bottom. So we have width segments, depth segments, and height segments for extra detail. And then we've got those 3 dimensions, so I can increase the height, increase the depth, and increase the width. So that's your pyramid. And the last primitive is the plane itself. And so it's this last one here. And the plane, very simple. It's used quite a lot in 3D. We do use it for ground planes, for floor objects, for windows, doors, anything where there's a large flat surface. And we can cut more detail into it. I can bring more length segments into it, more width segments into it. I can use these render modifiers, which I won't cover at the moment, but basically they help later on when you want to put modifiers on it, like a noise modifier. It can increase or decrease the scale and density, which gives you your total amount of faces. Something that I'm not going to cover in this early stage. But yeah, that's the plane. So they're your primitive objects, and you will use those a lot in 3D. So really take the time to familiarize yourself with how to set these up, how to create them, how to use them, because a lot of the objects you'll create, no matter how complex, will start their life as a primitive object, and you need to know how much detail to build into that primitive object so that you're not cutting so much detail into the model as you go. It helps to have that detail when you start off. Okay, so we're going to build our scene. So I'm just going to reset max. Don't need to save here. And we've got our standard viewport scenario. So the first thing I'm going to do is build the base of the snowman, and we're going to use a sphere to build that. So I'm just going to go with a sphere object, and I'm going to use the keyboard method. Now all of these objects, primitive objects, have the ability to use a keyboard entry method instead of dragging out in the viewport like so. I can actually punch in the details for the sphere I'm trying to create, and hit the create button, and it will create it. Now, the X, Y, and Z numbers are for where in 3D space this object is going to be created. Now, if they're 0, 0, 0, they're going to be created at the 0 world coordinate, which is right in the center of our grid here. And you'll notice that I'm using the top view to create them in. Now, I'll show you what the difference is here. If I put in a radius of, we want the diameter to be around about 70, so I'm just going to put in 35 as my radius and go create. Now, notice how it's oriented, and if I switch on my wireframe down here, notice how it's oriented in the viewport with the smaller polygons at the top here. And I'm just going to move that to the side for a moment. Now watch what happens if I do the same process in the front view instead of the top view. I'll go to my keyboard entry, and notice it remembers the last keyboard entry that I used, and just go create. So have a look at the difference there. It's oriented very different. The left one is oriented to the top, and so it's got the poles at the top and the bottom. And this one has the poles at the front and the back. So which viewport you create an object in, you can get a very different product. So I'm just going to undo those, bring my sphere back to the center. So we're happy with where that has been created, right at the center of our scene. Now the next method I'm going to use to create a sphere, so if I click on the sphere, I'm just going to click and drag, and I'm going to do it in the center here, and this is for our second body part for the snowman. So I'm just going to roughly try to get right in the center. I'm going to drag up until I get a sphere that's, you'll see in the front view here, it's probably about 2/3 the size. And it's a very rough way to create a sphere. It's not very accurate on two levels. One, if you look at the settings here, we've got all sorts of decimal point measurements here, and it's much better, especially with something as primitive as this model, to just keep things nice and rounded. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go 25 on the radius. Segments, I'm going to increase the segments because it's very squared off, it's not very smooth, and we don't have a polygon budget for this scene, so we can make as many polygons as we want as long as we don't drive our machine into the ground. So I'm going to put 72 up in there, and I'm going to do the same with the base sphere. So I'm selecting the base sphere again, and I'm just punching 72 into that one as well. So let's grab our second sphere that we just created, and notice down here in the X, Y, and Z that it's not perfectly at world 0 because we drew it, we roughly eyeballed it from the top view to when we created it, and you'll never get that perfect. You'll always be a couple of decimal points out, and sometimes a lot more. So what we'll do is right click on the spinners, and anytime you right click a spinner in, and this is a spinner here, anytime you right click a spinner in 3D Studio Max, you reset its value to 0, which is a really handy tip. So right click these spinners, and we now have a sphere that is perfectly sitting at world 0 like the larger sphere. Now in the front view, let's go ahead and drag that up until they sort of penetrate one another at the base here. And you'll see in the perspective view, constantly checking your perspective view is a great way of working because you can't always see what's obvious in a perspective viewport in these other viewports. So let's go ahead and drag that down just a little bit more, something like that, and it's looking pretty good. Now let's click on the color swatch just to change it to a similar color, and we can go ahead and create our third sphere. Now we're going to use a duplication method to create our third sphere. Now we're going to grab the sphere, I'm going to hold down shift, and I'm just going to drag up in the Y axis just until I get to somewhere here. We can reposition it in a moment. Still perfectly on the X and Y at world center. And once we've dragged it, we can play with our radius dimensions here. So let's put that down to, let's go to 20 and see what it looks like. It's probably still a bit big. Let's wind it down and get something rough. That looks pretty good. So let's even it out at 17. And we'll just check our perspective view to see how that's working. And we could probably come down just a little bit. Probably about there, looks good. So we have the 3 body parts in the snowman model, and we can go ahead and start to work on a little bit more detail. So just while we're in that front view, let's zoom into the face model here, or the head sphere, and I'm going to create a geosphere. So if I select the geosphere, now what we didn't cover in the earlier section was the geosphere. We actually forgot to cover it. So I'm going to pull this forward and just explain quickly what a geosphere is. If I zoom in here, go to a shaded mode, there we go. You'll notice, in fact, what I'll do is scale it right up so we can sit it side by side the other sphere. You'll notice that the geosphere has a radically different mesh than the sphere. You've got a sphere on the left here and a geosphere on the right. The sphere on the left, as the segments get to the top, the poles, they get smaller and smaller until they touch that very last point. The geosphere has a mesh that never gets smaller. It's always consistent over the entire thing, which is very good for sky domes. There's a lot of purposes that a geosphere is superior to a normal sphere. And I can increase the segments to make it smoother, and I can increase the radius here to increase the size. So, and you've got a couple of different methods, and it changes the actual. At the moment, you'll see that we've got these sort of triangles. If I go octagonal, the collection of triangles is a lot different. It's basically a different geometrical base, and then you've got a tetrahedral, which is also a different geometric base. So it depends. The isosceles is basically the way to go, because the triangles are even. These triangles tend to be, depending on what your settings are, can actually get away from you a little bit. And once again, the hemisphere, you can't wind the hemisphere up and down, but it does actually create a base to it as well, as you can see there. But it's literally a 50% cutting in hemisphere. Okay, so let's bring that size down. We're looking in this front view here. We'll just go back to a wireframe and bring the size down until we get something that's roughly the size of the eyes that we want to use, and that looks pretty good. And we don't need maybe that much detail. Something like that looks okay. Maybe 5. 4 is probably just as good. Okay, from the front view, we've got our eye there, but it's way out in front of the model in the left view. So let's go ahead and move it back in the left view, but the whole time we should be looking at the perspective view to see how it's looking. So keep moving it back until it halfway, or is at least looks like it's been pushed into the snow of that head model. And that's working fine. And the next thing I'm going to do is use a mirror technique to copy this over. We're happy with where that is, but I want another eye over here. And the easiest way to do that is to grab your mirror, grab your eye object. In fact, we might just give it a grey material. And then make sure that your gizmo or your axes type is set to view. And then click mirror. And it pops up with this one here. And if we've got our clone sections down the bottom, we don't need a reference or an instance or a copy. We need a copy. And if we push the offset, and notice here it's in the X, we're actually offsetting the position of that in X. Now, what we can actually do is just roughly eyeball it, but we want to be a lot more specific than that. So just go OK. Grab your first eyeball and look at this number down here, and we're going to change that to 7, a nice round number, and that means that this is 7 on the X off the center line. This one should be -7, and now it's perfectly aligned with that center line. It's exactly the same distance off the center line. One's negative and one's positive, and you'll see in the perspective view that it perfectly sits on the face of the model there on both sides. So the next thing we're going to do is create our mouth, our smile. So we'll go ahead and this time we'll create a sphere, and I'm just going to draw it roughly where I want it, probably about here, and it's going to be quite small. It's going to be smaller than that eyeball, and that's probably about the size I want. Probably don't need 72. Let's bring that back to about let's go 48 on that one. And let's make the radius a nice round figure. We'll go 1.5. Now we need to reposition it. So we're going to pull it out, and remember that we're looking at the perspective here to try to work out, is that going to give me the shape that I want? I could probably pull it out a little bit further. That's probably fine there, I think. Maybe in just slightly. That's it there. And we'll change the color of that to that same grey color. We can use the same method again. Let's mirror that one in the front view and just offset it over as a copy to the left. Just roughly line it up. Grab your first one. This one's 5.25. Let's go 5.25 as a nice round number, which means this one needs to be minus 5.25. And that's going to work nicely. Same method again, just grab this one here, only this time we're going to move it into axes. So I'm holding down shift and I'm dragging it up, and on 2 axes means I can move up and down and left and right. So I'm just going to pop it probably about there, and it's a copy. So we go OK, and I'm just looking at my perspective view here, and I'm moving it in that left view. Something like that looks okay. And then we can mirror that in the front view. Just drag it over, eyeball it, we'll just make this a nice round figure. Let's make it 10. We'll just make sure that still looks okay in that viewport. Yep, looks fine. So this one here should be -10. And we just need one more sphere, so I'm just going to shift and drag that one down to the middle. And I want to perfectly line it up with the center line, so I can right click and clear that out to 0. And then we just look at our perspective view and we drag it forward until we get what we're looking for. So that's working okay. The next thing we need to do is create our nose, and we're going to use a cone for that. So just in the front view, I'm going to click on the cone primitive, and somewhere in the center here, just going to click and drag it, which creates the first radius. Releasing the mouse and continuing to drag creates the height, which you can see in that left bottom view there. It's getting taller. About there is fine. And then by clicking again, I'm adjusting the second radius. So I'm just going to move that in a little bit, something like that. You'll see down here that we've created that cone shape. It needs to be brought forward, and I'm going to change the color to an orange color, just representative of a carrot, so to speak. And it looks like the height's a little bit big, so let's go ahead in the modify panel. Let's just bring the height back a little bit, something like that, and then maybe the radius one could come back a little bit as well. And then in the left view, let's go ahead and rotate that a little bit. Just pull it down, something like that, and just move it forward a little bit. Always checking to see, is it working in that perspective viewport. Okay, so we need to create a hat for our snowman. We're going to do that in top view. But I'm going to do it, you'll see how congested this area is here. I'm going to do it off to the side, and then we can move it over. So we're going to use a cylinder for the base of the hat first. And I'm just going to roughly click and drag out, and that gives me my radius of the cylinder. And then when I release and continue to drag, it gives me my height. Now I'm just going to set it, I like to just get the shape created and then come in and quickly give it the radius settings and the height settings. Now the height, this is the brim of the hat. I'm just going to put that down to 2 units. And by the way, the units I'm working to at the moment, 1 unit equals 1 centimeter. So that's just 2 centimeters thick, that one there, which is fine. Now in the top view, what I'm going to do is right click on all of my spinners, and that perfectly resets my the brim of the hat back to world center. And from the front view then, I can just click and drag up until it sits on the snowman's head. And that's looking okay there. But I think we got a bit too much detail in the segments here. So let's decrease the height segments. We can come back to 2. The cap segments are fine at 1. We'll make that an even 2 as well. But we want to smooth it off a little bit. It's a little bit too square. And it's probably a bit thick. So let's go back to 1 centimeter. So there's the rim or the brim of the hat. And we're going to duplicate that, holding Shift and dragging. And what we want to do, we want to copy, so we'll go okay. What we want to do is make sure they intersect. Don't have it on top of it, actually have it just inside, just like that. And we're going to reduce the radius until we get to about there. See that it's not going to, if I come back to a shaded mode, or show you in here, if I go too much on the radius, it'll actually show through the head there. So we want to make it a little bit bigger than the sphere that makes the head, and then we just increase the height. And it's up to you how much you want the height. You could have quite a short hat like this one, or quite tall, or something basically in the middle. We'll give it a few more height segments, just a little bit more detail, and everything else is working fine there. So let's go ahead and grab that and make it black. Same with the rim, and make it black. And we're just about got all of the geometry done for our snowman object. We just need to put some buttons on his chest. And if we go to the roughly in the center here, we'll go with a sphere, and we're just going to create one right in the center about here. And in the left view, we're just going to pull it forward, line it up, see how it's working in the perspective. Probably push it back a little bit, something like that. That seems to work okay. Change the color to that gray again. I guess it's supposed to be representative of coal or something like that. And then what we want to do is move that. We're in the side view, holding shift and just dragging up. We know that in the top view that it's right in the center. Or do we? Let's correct it first. We don't. See, it's 0.04. So let's just right click, and now it's bang in the center. We know it's perfectly in the center. Now in the left view, we can hold shift, drag it up to create our second button, just making sure that it's working okay in that perspective view, and that looks pretty good. And we can hold shift and drag down to here, and then just move it forward a little bit until we get something that we're looking for that other button, and that looks pretty good. So there's our snowman, but we want to put it in some sort of scene. So I'm going to create a ground plane here. Now in the top view, I'm going to pull out quite a lot. I'm going to grab a plane, and I'm going to draw out a plane. And then I'm going to right click on all the spinners to reset it back to 0. And then I'm going to really increase the segments. So let's go 70 by 70, which is quite a dense mesh for what we need, but I think it's going to work nicely. In fact, let's go 100 by 100. Like I said before, we don't have a polygon. We don't have a polygon budget for this project. And the first thing you'll see is that it cuts into our snowman, and that's quite okay because it's supposed to be representative of snow. So let's go ahead and we'll make the ground plane white. And then in the front view, I'm going to use a marquee box to grab all 3 main shapes and make those white as well. And then on this ground plane, we're going to add a modifier, which we haven't used yet, but it's good to know that you can just put modifiers on top of primitives. And I'm going to click the modifier in the modify panel. I'm just clicking the down arrow, and I'm going to use a noise modifier. Now the Z is the one we want because it cranks it up and down in the Z axis, which you'll see here is the up and down axis. The Y is traveling back here. The X is traveling left and right. So it is the Z. So let's go ahead and ramp up that Z. And remember, we're using centimeters, and the base is 70 centimeters in diameter. So we can really crank that up, something like this, because we're going to increase the scale just to bring a bit of smoothness back to it, something like that. And if we change the perspective of the camera angle, something like this, and we could even move the ground plane around a little bit just until we get something that we like. And that looks pretty good. Maybe come out a little bit. And the last thing we want to do is grab our environment just in the render settings and change the background color from black to an almost white, something like that. And let's give it a little test render, see how it's working. So there's our test render. Now it's not lit at all, and the surfaces look a little bit non-uniform. The background looks a little bit out of whack relative to the snow here and things like that. But basically you have the starting point of a very simple primitive based scene where nothing is created using any box modeling or poly modeling, and everything is based on primitive objects. And it's understandable. You can see what scene it is. You can see basically what you're looking at, and there's some great processes that you've got to cover to actually create a scene like that. So like I said before, this is a very entry-level tutorial for people that haven't played with Max much before, or for people that have but have wanted to know how to create those primitives, get used to moving things, scaling things, playing with the spinners. There's a couple of tips in there for how to center your spinners and reset them to 0, things like that. So a great little tutorial, I think, for people that are just starting out with Max, because you really, like I said before, you've got to really understand how primitives work so that you can take it to the next level for really detailed models, because they all start their lives as primitive objects. So go ahead and play with primitives, become very familiar with them, and it'll only improve your 3D work. So that's it for me. Until next time, bye for now.